Okay. There we go. Um, Now, last week we went through the time of King Uzziah, and today we're going to finish up all the rest of the kings of the southern kingdom of Judah. We're going to cover about 400 years in the next 50 minutes or so, and we'll begin here. There was really no hope of Judah being able to withstand Assyrian pressure without outside help. But whatever the reason, King Ahaz of Judah, who was Uzziah's grandson, refused to join Rezon of Damascus and Pekah ben Remaliah of Israel, because Israel was still around at this time, in their alliance against Assyria. Probably because King Ahaz felt that as long as he preserved an alliance with the far distant Assyrians and didn't interfere with any Assyrian designs, such as free movement along the coastal plain in any future Assyrian conflicts with Egypt, it would not be in Assyria's interest to become entangled in the Judean highlands. So consequently, when King Ahaz refused to join the alliance of Rezon of Damascus and Pekah of Israel, both those kings invaded Judah with the intention of coercing Judah into the alliance. Although the prophet Isaiah tried to give King Ahaz some confidence against the two invaders, King Ahaz panicked and he called on the Assyrian ruler Tiglath-Pileser to come to his assistance. And during this period of lost confidence and warfare with the sister kingdom of Israel, Edom, Philistia, and much of the Negev here in the south were once more lost to Judah. King Ahaz's entire reign is recorded in 2 Kings chapter 16 or 2 Chronicles chapter 28, and also in Isaiah chapter 7. If you had a chance to read any of those, the King's version and the Chronicles version are very close. Isaiah obviously was coming at this period of history from a totally different point of view. And so the prophet Isaiah's account is quite different. And it's kind of interesting to see how the two sides wrote about this period. But we're not going to go any further into King Ahaz than that. Let's see. Let's look at, here we go. So, a nation's destiny is often shaped by its ability to stand up to challenges. The fall of France, Dunkirk, the Luftwaffe bombing of Britain in 1940s, these were all factors that finally moved the entire nation to mobilize. And in many ways, the fall of the sister kingdom of Samaria in 722 BC had a similar effect on the Judeans. Out of the trauma of the loss and the deportation of 10 of the 12 tribes that made up the Jewish people, the Judeans were moved to action and ready to sacrifice whatever was needed to preserve their national identity and their independence. It requires, of course, that the right people be in the right places and that the right leaders emerge at the right time to make good use of a national upsurgence and steer it in the right direction. King Hezekiah, who was King Ahaz's son, was just such the person. His 30-year-long reign, which began in 724 BC, has earned him the highest biblical praise. So, Bonnie, have you got 2 Kings 18:5?
Yes. Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among the kings of Judah, either before him or after him.
Pretty high praise. In his internal reforms, King Hezekiah, much like King Jehoshaphat before him, followed the Davidic precedent and he made the priestly tribe of the Levites the agents of his cultural, administrative, and religious reforms. In security affairs, his first efforts were aimed at reestablishing their control over the Negev and of Edom. To achieve a permanent and secure presence in both these locations, he sent surplus Simeonite population into these areas to establish permanent settlements. His advances into the former northern kingdom was preceded by religious emissaries who destroyed the altars as far as Bethel and up in Samaria. And he called upon the remaining Israelites to come to Jerusalem and to sacrifice and accept Jerusalem as their spiritual center. Then at a certain stage, King Hezekiah proclaimed open rebellion against the Assyrians. So we got Art.
2 Kings 18. And the Lord was with him. He was successful in whatever he undertook. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. From watchtower to fortified city, he defeated the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory.
So the relationships with the Philistines were a little more complicated than what's depicted there in 2 Kings. From sources outside the Bible, we know that the overriding danger of a common foe had served to alleviate this mutual hatred that existed between Judah and the Philistines, which only increased during King Ahaz's reign, when the Philistines had already begun to occupy the foothills of Judah from Ajalon down to Soko. But because of this threat of a common foe, i.e. Assyria, there was an alliance that was formed between the Philistines, the king of Ashkelon, and Judah together. Even though they consistently hated each other, they formed this alliance against Assyria. And this enabled Hezekiah to recapture most or all of the lost territories and to bring much of the domains of Gaza back under his control. Gaza is located right here in the corner. It's possible that also by this time, King Hezekiah had already opened up negotiations with the Babylonians, who began to pose a serious threat to the Assyrian domain because of an uprising that was occurring in Mesopotamia, which was actually the mainstay of Assyria's power. In any case, because there was a large Jewish deportations, because of the large Jewish deportations into the interior of the Assyrian Empire and particularly into Babylon, King Hezekiah certainly had very good intelligence and constant flow of information about the happenings that were going on in Assyria because of those large deportations of kinsmen. The third partner in this alliance, this Judean Ashkelon alliance, was Egypt. The pharaohs who had never recovered their former might were always sensitive to the fact that permanent occupation of the Palestinian land bridge by any other great power other than Egypt was a potential first step towards the conquest of the land of the Nile that was famous for its resources and its riches. Pharaoh Shabaka became an active member in this alliance with Judah and the Philistines. Among the fortifications, Jerusalem was the foremost. Jim, you got 2 Chronicles 35:5.
Mm-hmm. Then he worked hard repairing all the broken sections of the wall and building towers on it. He built another wall outside that one and reinforced the terraces of the city of David. He also made large numbers of weapons and shields.
So in other words, he repaired the breaches in the walls of Jerusalem, which had been made during King Ahaz's days and had never been mended. The basic enlargement of the Jerusalem defense had already been achieved by Hezekiah's great grandfather, the great King Uzziah that we talked about last week. And this work was continued by Jotham, King Jotham, in 2 Chronicles 26:9 and 27:3. Pat? Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
Sorry, that's my one job.
Computer.
Okay.
Uzziah built towers in Jerusalem at the corner gate, at the valley gate, and at the angle of the wall, and he fortified them. Jotham rebuilt the upper gate of the temple of the Lord and did extensive work on the wall at the hill of Ophel.
So we see that a major attention was being paid to strengthening the natural weak points of any fortress, which are the entrances and the angles in the walls. The method applied was the construction of protruding towers that would expose the flanks of the assault parties to the weapons of the fortress defenders. According to the traditional translation of the chronicler, King Uzziah armed these towers with missile shooting engines. Back to Bonnie, 2 Chronicles 26:15.
Yeah, I have that, Gordon. In Jerusalem,
Oh, all right.
he made devices intended for use on the towers and on the corner defenses so that soldiers could shoot arrows and hurl large stones from the walls. His fame spread far and wide, for he was greatly helped until he became powerful.
Okay, so this is the first mention in written records of the use of artillery ordnance. Of course, the translation of the original Hebrew and the King James versions are open to some question. And the reason is this passage is 500 years earlier than any proven and 300 years earlier than any assumed missile shooting contraptions. By the way, the Roman tradition tells us that the invention of missile shooting engines is credited to the Syro-Phoenician region on the north side of the Mediterranean. So the questions that arise from the translations are about whether these contraptions were merely catapults or some other technical advancement in weaponry. Yet among the arguments against identifying these as catapults is the fact that not a single mention or pictorial representation from the vast amount of written and graphic material coming out of Assyria, which was the foremost military power of the day, can be cited for these types of machines. If the Assyrians had not themselves invented these machines, they would have adopted them, or at least mentioned their capture and destruction. To prevent the fall of the country's fortresses because of lack of food during long sieges, King Hezekiah provided his cities with storehouses. Art, you got 2 Chronicles 32?
He also made buildings to store the harvest of grain, new wine, and olive oil, and he made stalls for the various kinds of cattle and pens for the flocks. He built villages and acquired great numbers of flocks and herds, for God had given him very great riches.
So in the absence of ample stores of meat and other preserved foods, the installation of a reserve of livestock was a pretty good idea. But probably the greatest feat was the provision of a permanent source of water for Jerusalem in case of a siege. Jim, 2 Chronicles 32?
Yes, it was Hezekiah who blocked the upper outlet of the Gihon spring and channeled the water down to the west side of the city of David. He succeeded in everything he undertook.
So what Hezekiah's engineers did was to close the outlet of the spring of Gihon at the foot of the city walls in Jerusalem and divert the spring water through a subterranean tunnel over 1,700 feet long and between 11 and 3 feet in diameter into a specially constructed pool inside the city walls. In the year 1880, some kids were playing in this tunnel and they discovered an inscription in Hebrew. initially thought it was graffiti, but it actually turned out to be an authentic inscription that was placed in that tunnel to commemorate its completion thousands of years earlier. The existing fragment of this reads this way. And this was the matter of the boring. In other words, this is how this tunnel was accomplished. When yet the hewers, the guys who were cutting through the rock, were lifting the pick, each towards his fellow, meaning they started at opposite ends of the tunnel and worked towards the middle. And when yet there were 3 cubits to be bored, a cubit is the length of your forearm, approximately the length of your forearm.
It's a cube.
When they were yet 3 cubits to be bored, heard was the voice of each calling to his fellows. For there was a fissure even from south to north. And on the end of the boring, the hewers struck each to meet his fellow, pick against pick. Then went the waters from the issue to the pool for 200 and 1,000 cubits, over 1,700 feet. And 100 cubits was the height of the rock above the head of the hewers.
Wow.
That's a pretty amazing accomplishment. And what I want to do now is show you a video that I think you'll enjoy. It's a short video. I'm just going to pause here so that there's no confusion. The Canaanite tunnel is different than Hezekiah's tunnel. The Canaanite tunnel was constructed a couple of thousand years before King Hezekiah, but the sole purpose of that tunnel was not to steal the water. There was still full access to the Gihon spring, but they channeled off water through the Canaanite tunnel, and then they cut holes along the way so that the water would run out into their vineyards and their farmland. This was their form of irrigating. It's pretty inventive. But this tunnel is a couple of thousand years before Hezekiah's tunnel.
Yeah.
Hmm.
That was massive.
I find that absolutely amazing that they were able to do that work
Mm.
and successfully cut that tunnel through there. That's just mind blowing. A tremendous feat. And if you ever get a chance to visit Jerusalem, you can take a tour and you can walk through the tunnel. Both the Canaanite tunnel and Hezekiah's tunnel are open to the public to take a stroll through. If you don't mind your feet being ice cold.
Is it still used for
Of course, in the
irrigation?
heat of the summer in Jerusalem, that might feel pretty good.
Is it,
So if I ever go there, that's definitely going to be on my list.
Warren,
Okay. Yes,
is it still used for irrigation? Do you know?
I don't think so. No. I guess it's possible, but I don't think so. Not in the same way it was, but
Yeah.
I mean, it is an unending source of water in Jerusalem. Even during dry spells, it doesn't seem to dry up. So,
No.
but I'm really not sure about the actual modern infrastructure of Jerusalem, that they probably have many wells by this time. So I don't know. Let's see. All right. So King Hezekiah's preparations served him pretty well. And when the Assyrians started to invade in 701 BC, the course of Sennacherib's campaign, his division of forces, and the prolonged sieges, and his subsequent withdrawal from Judah with loss of face, leaving the kingdom independent, is something that we talked about back in session 9 under Judah's fortifications under Rehoboam. We talked about Sennacherib coming down and attacking these cities, trying to secure entrances into the Judean mountains, and another section of his army coming down from Jerusalem and getting blocked at the pass. So we talked about that. One prearranged last-minute step of the Judeans is cited in 2 Chronicles 32, 2 through 4. Whoever's got that one.
When Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come and that he intended to wage war against Jerusalem, he consulted with his officials and military staff about blocking off the water from the springs outside the city, and they helped him. They gathered a large group of people who blocked all the springs and streams that flowed through the land. Why should the kings of Assyria come and find plenty of water, they said.
So although these steps are no scorched earth policy in the full sense of the term, such as was practiced by the Russians in 1812 or again in 1941, they were very severe, and they had a detrimental effect on the rural population, the farmers and the shepherds around the city. So to carry out these steps effectively, King Hezekiah required the cooperation of the populace, and he got it. Historical narrative often lacks the descriptions of the attitude and reactions of individuals of the rank and file. But an old inscription that was uncovered in a burial cave, which was used at a hiding place during Sennacherib's siege of the city of Lachish here in the south, shed some light on the emotions that were feeling with the graffiti that was scribbled on the walls. These graffiti also included drawings of ships and of 3 people. The ships are most probably Ashkenazite ships from the Mediterranean, because they were part of this alliance that was formed with Judah against Sennacherib, or it could have been Egyptian vessels, because they were also part of the alliance. 2 of the 3 people depicted may have been Levites from the priestly tribe, one playing the lyre and the second one with his hands raised in prayer. The third figure was of someone wearing chainmail and armor and a helmet. Was this an effigy of the enemy, or was this just a depiction of a typical GI? We don't know. The Bible mentions one item of psychological warfare used by the invaders that strikes us as rather modern, that being this constant haranguing in Hebrew of the besieged citizens of Jerusalem. In a succession of arguments using ridicule, terror, promises, slanted information, quote, logical proof of the futility of it all, the Assyrians tried to break the defenders' will to resist. But the books of Kings and the book of Chronicles quote the chief of Assyrian commanders as addressing the defenders personally in Hebrew. So if they were indeed able to communicate without interpreters, then we would have proof of the relative importance of the Jewish Commonwealth in international affairs in the closing years of the 8th century. There are two accounts in the Bible about this attempted brainwashing, and that's in 2 Kings 18, 19 to 36, and 2 Chronicles 32, 10 to 19. But they're both very, very close together, so we're only going to hear one from, I think Bonnie's up next.
Yes. 2 Kings 18, 19 through 36. The field commander said to them, "Tell Hezekiah, this is what the great king, the king of Assyria, says. On what are you basing this confidence of yours? You say that you have the counsel and the might for war, but you speak only empty words. On whom are you depending, that you rebel against me? Look, I know you are depending on Egypt, that splintered reed of a staff, which pierces the hand of anyone who leans on it. Such is Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, to all who depend on him. But if you say to me, we are depending on the Lord our God, isn't he the one whose high places and altars Hezekiah removed, saying to Judah and Jerusalem, you must worship before this altar in Jerusalem? Come now, make a bargain with my master, the king of Assyria. I will give you 2,000 horses, if you can put riders on them. How can you repulse one officer of the least of my master's officials, even though you are depending on Egypt for chariots and horsemen? Furthermore, have I come to attack and destroy this place without word from the Lord? The Lord himself told me to march against this country and destroy it." Then Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, and Shebna and Joah said to the field commander, "Please speak to your servants in Aramaic, since we understand it. Don't speak to us in Hebrew in the hearing of the people on the wall." But the commander replied, "Was it only to your master and you that my master sent me to say these things, and not to the people sitting on the wall, who, like you, will have to eat their own excrement and drink their own urine?" Then the commander stood and called out in Hebrew, "Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. This is what the king says. Do not let Hezekiah deceive you. He cannot deliver you from my hand. Do not let Hezekiah persuade you to trust in the Lord when he says, the Lord will surely deliver us. This city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah. This is what the king of Assyria says. Make peace with me and come out to me. Then each of you will eat fruit from your own vine and fig tree and drink water from your own cistern until I come and take you to a land like your own, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive trees and honey. Choose life and not death. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for he is misleading you when he says, the Lord will deliver us. Has the God of any nation ever delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, Hena, and Ivah? Have they rescued Samaria from my hand? Who of all the gods of these countries has been able to save this land from me? How then can the Lord deliver Jerusalem from my hand? But the people remained silent and said nothing in reply, because the king had commanded, do not answer him.
Sorry for the Assyrians, but the Lord had the last word in this affair. The choice of the spot for this attempted brainwashing was opposite the upper pool, the receptacle for the Gihon spring waters flowing through the recently completed tunnel. It's possible that this spot was chosen to impress the Jerusalemites with the fact that all of their efforts and preparations notwithstanding, there was no escape from Sennacherib. The Assyrian general derided Hezekiah's failure to have built an adequate corps of cavalry, but the defenders, knowing that competing with the Assyrian horsemen would have been futile at any time, was offset by the foresight of the king in making Jerusalem immune from thirst. Sennacherib's retreat did much to enhance Judah's prestige, so much so that Merodach-Baladan, king of Babylonia, sent an official envoy to King Hezekiah with letters and gifts. However, Assyria's strength was far from broken. On the contrary, Sennacherib and Esarhaddon renewed their relentless campaigning with the goal of conquering Egypt. But the outcome and the experience that they had had during their 701 BC campaign paved the way to an understanding with the Judeans. While Judah would abstain from interference with any Assyrian designs and military operations along the coastal plain, Assyria would refrain from attacking Judah. In 669 BC, Esarhaddon succeeded in conquering Lower Egypt, and in 663 BC, the Assyrians conquered Upper Egypt. So now Assyria's power was supreme in the region, and King Manasseh, the current king of Judah, Zedekiah's son, saw no choice but to accept Assyrian overlordship, even to the extent of providing Assyria with auxiliary forces for his military enterprises. In his wish to appease his masters, or at their insistence, he threw Judah wide open to pagan practices. This compromise, combined with the strongly fortified borders, at least preserved the integrity of the Judean heartland, and it enabled King Manasseh to undertake comprehensive military preparations and reorganizations near the end of his 55-year-long reign, when internal troubles among the Assyrians caused them to start to lose their grip on this huge empire. The true heir to King Hezekiah's policy was King Josiah, who exploited Assyria's growing weakness by making his religious emissaries the spearhead of his political expansion. The discovery in the temple of the book of Deuteronomy served as an incentive for cleansing the country of alien influences, and Judah underwent a rapid process of religious rejuvenation. The spirit of national pride served as a magnet for the leaderless Israelite rural population on both sides of the Jordan River, as well as, if you recall, when the northern kingdom was exiled, they were replaced by Gentiles from Mesopotamia. And these individuals that were transplanted in Israel had adapted themselves to the Jewish culture. Consequently, during the first decade of his reign, King Josiah achieved virtual rule over most of former Israelite Cisjordan, as well as over parts of Gilead. The Bible doesn't mention anything about his fortifications, but archaeological activity has brought to light a very strong fortress on the seashore, about 7.5 miles north of Ashdod, that can definitely be identified as Josiah's building. Its purpose was twofold: guarding the frontiers with the Philistines and blocking any hostile movement along the coastal plain. The second purpose indicates to us that Josiah was uneasy about Egypt's revival as a power. His fears were not unfounded. Judah's security depended on a balance of power between the big three of those days: Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. As long as these three canceled out each other's surplus aggression, there was a good chance that small little Judah could survive. None was more keenly aware of this situation than the kings of Judah, whose realm was situated on the traditional warpath of these three great powers. King Hezekiah had already played his part in bringing about the balance of power. King Manasseh's temporary captivity had made Assyria the leading power in his time. But since then, Assyria had been torn by internal rivalries. Babylonia and Media combined to deprive Assyria of most of her possessions, including Nineveh, the capital. At the same time, Egypt regained her liberty, and Pharaoh Stamtik, who was the first pharaoh of the 25th dynasty, worked hard to tip the new tripartite power balance in his favor. By coming to the aid of the Assyrians, the pharaoh hoped to halt any Babylonian aspirations to become the formal successor as the sole or the main power on the land bridge. The pharaoh wanted that position for himself. So the Babylonians were steadily gaining against the Assyrians. So Egypt decided, it's best that we go in and try to help the Assyrians to ward off the Babylonians. As it was precisely this Egyptian objective which King Josiah of Judah feared and tried to frustrate, he refused Pharaoh Necho's free passage through the Judean territories when the Pharaoh went in 609 BC north on his campaign to aid Assyria in its last stand against the Neo-Babylonians. King Josiah was playing for very high stakes. Not only did he disregard the Egyptian offer of neutrality, but he chose not to impede the progress of the Egyptian army through the coastal plain or its passage through the notorious Iron Pass, which traversed the Carmel Mountains into the Jezreel. Instead, he took up his own position in the open country near Megiddo, where the Iron Pass opens up into the Jezreel Valley. What's so dramatic about this setting is that for the first time since the Exodus, some 3,000 years earlier, Jews and Egyptians crossed swords in a major battle. In choosing his battlefield, King Josiah was making a psychological as well as a political statement. His plan was to prove the military superiority of Judah over Egypt in a set battle in the open field. He hoped that by doing so, he would create a lasting deterrent impression on any other would-be invaders. Tactically, he banked on catching his enemy disorganized and off balance just as they were emerging from the pass, the very narrow pass, onto the open plain, and on making the Carmel Range a huge anvil against which to pound and crush the Egyptians with a general attack of chariots and infantry. A retreat back through the Carmel and then all the way back down to Egypt along the coastal plain with their exposed left flank towards the Judean mountains would have meant disaster. King Josiah's plan was audacious. Religious fervor may have accounted for the moral strength to take such a calculated risk. However, we also must assume that King Josiah judged both the size and the quality of his army to be a fair match for Pharaoh Necho's army. By the way, King Josiah had not overlooked what he thought would be the unlikely event of having to retreat himself. And in this contingency, the fortress at Megiddo was at hand to serve as a safe harbor, as were the many natural caves all throughout the Carmel Mountains. Pharaoh Necho must have sensed that the Judean army might attack before he could effect an orderly full deployment in the valley. So he formed his massed archers into an advanced screening force to break, or at least slow down, the expected Judean attack on his formations that were trying to deploy coming out of this narrow valley. Also, he directed his archers to try to identify the Judean king and concentrate their fire on the royal chariot. And just as what happened at Ramoth Gilead, this strategy worked. King Josiah was mortally wounded by an Egyptian arrow in the very beginning stages of the battle. And with the death of the king, the battle was lost. And with the lost battle, Judah's plans to maintain this international equilibrium came to nothing. The obscure archer who killed Josiah in 609 BC at Megiddo fired the first shot in Judah's final downfall. So let's jump to
Right.
So in about 605 BC, the Judean kingdom, which was now weakened by the unexpected death of its charismatic leader, became a vassal state of the Neo-Babylonian ruler Nebuchadnezzar, king and master of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But even in this situation, the nation didn't lose its belief in its strength and ability to shake off foreign dominance. The religious enthusiasm brought about by Josiah's reforms was so persistent and deep-rooted that people refused to take matters at their face value. Against the isolated voice of the prophet Jeremiah, who preached temporary submission to Babylonia as a divinely sanctioned step towards diplomacy, many a false prophet called for active measures and rebellion. To ward off any ideas of a rebellion on the strategic land bridge in 598 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar dispatched a special army, which succeeded in laying siege to Jerusalem and forced the complete submission of King Jehoiachin, who accepted personal exile and allowed the temple to be totally spoiled in order to save Jerusalem from utter destruction. Together with the king, 10,000 captives were carried off, including the great nobles and officers of the state, and the craftsmen and the blacksmiths. The obvious intention was to deprive Judah both of its leaders and its technicians and craftsmen to prevent her from mounting another rebellion. Yet King Nebuchadnezzar's strategy didn't work. It took only an Egyptian naval demonstration off the Phoenician coast just north of Tyre and some Egyptian landing parties in 591 BC to induce the new king of Judah, Zedekiah, to prepare another uprising. The preparations were once again spurred on by religious fervor, which was also used to push social reforms so as to make every citizen see that his cause was worth fighting for. Egypt's assistance was sought by King Zedekiah, and the new anti-Babylonian alliance was formed between Judah and Egypt. But Nebuchadnezzar sensed the need to act before this alliance could make any comprehensive preparations. And in 588, he hurried down through Syria to subdue the rebellious Jews. And let's jump to Judah's defenses were defeated after heavy fighting. Of this epic struggle, vivid description has been found. Excavations down here in the city of Lachish have brought to light a number of pieces of pottery with writings that were dispatches from the commander of a small outpost by the name of Hoshayahu, who came under the command of Yahush, the military governor of Lachish. One message was written during the crucial phase of the assault upon the Judean heartland, and it read, "For the signal stations of Lachish we are watching, according to all the signs which my Lord gives, because we do not see the signals of Azekah." And what this means is that the city of Azekah had already fallen, and the Babylonians were now marshaling their vast forces for a final assault on Lachish and the other strongholds, because they knew better than to penetrate into the Judean mountains without having cleared all these approaches. In the end, Jerusalem came under its last siege prior to the Babylonian exile. Egypt did make an attempt to help Judah, but that futile attempt only reminded King Nebuchadnezzar that as long as the Judean state existed, The Babylonian position on the Palestinian land bridge was never going to be secure. The defenders also understood the seriousness of this situation, and the defenders of Jerusalem held out for 2 more years. The last reading there, Art, 2 Kings 25, 2 through 12.
The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. Then the city wall was broken through, and the whole army fled at night through the gate between the 2 walls near the king's garden, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city. They fled to Arabah, but the Babylonian army pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. He was taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah, where sentence was pronounced on him. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Then they put out his eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. On the 7th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. The whole Babylonian army, under the commander of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had deserted to the king of Babylon. But the commander left behind some of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and fields.
So, as shown here on the map, Zedekiah did make a last attempt at preserving the resistance, and he escaped at the head of some household troops to carry on the fighting, possibly from the Judean desert. But he was captured near Jericho before getting to safety. The city then was systematically destroyed by the Babylonian army, who also burned the first temple.
Wow.
And this is our last map. The exiles and the immigrants who left Judah preserved their warlike character even in their new settlements in foreign lands. The Jews began to figure prominently in armies and military settlements, both here in Babylonia and down in Egypt, and other territories, all the way down through the Roman period. These qualities were also one of the main reasons why King Cyrus, the king of Persia, who conquered the Babylonians, permitted and actively promoted the return of the Babylonian exiles back to Judah. After capturing Palestine during the Persian conquest that defeated the Babylonians in about 540 BC, King Cyrus wished to have the country secured by a population that was loyal and warlike, but not too strong to make itself independent. What better way than to grant the Jews the right to return to Judah? Therefore, in 537 BC, the first wave of repatriates was able to return to Judah and lay the foundation for the second commonwealth built around the second temple. So you notice how, well, I won't say quickly, but you notice how things change from from one empire to the other. And this is only the beginning. The Assyrians took over and they were replaced by the Persians, and they're going to be replaced. You'll find out. And then the ones that replace the Persians are going to be replaced. You'll find out. That's called a teaser. So that's it for today. 400 years in 50 minutes.
Warren,
So any questions? Yes, Art always has a question. Go ahead.
Warren, back in the beginning, I think you might have answered it, but I want to be sure. You had, there were deportations. What was the purpose of that? To clear the land, to dilute the Jewish people, to strengthen and spread them out where they were taken? What was the purpose of the deportations?
Well, the main purpose was to take them back to their home country in Babylonia to work as slaves, basically. It was slave labor. And it also opened up new territories for their own populations. That's why they were replaced.
Okay.